The United Nations nuclear watchdog calls for an immediate safety zone around a Russian-held nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. The International Atomic Energy Agency urged Russia and Ukraine on Tuesday to establish a nuclear safety and security protection zone around the Zaporizhzhia power plant amid mounting fears the shelling in the area could trigger a nuclear emergency. In a report following a visit by an inspection team last week, the agency said all of its safety principles had been compromised at the facility. Sergio Olmos has more in this report.
Well, these are the UN's top nuclear experts. They visited the plant and they came back with a report about the situation at the nuclear power plant. They're recommending that a security buffer zone be set up around the nuclear power plant. Their report is very long. It basically says that shelling cannot continue. They have assessed the situation there on the ground. I was there when they briefed the press, just returning from the plant, Rafael Mariano Grossi, saying that the most dangerous situation there is the physical integrity of the plant. The power lines being shelled was the most dangerous situation there, because that is the kind of Achilles heel. It's not the nuclear reactors themselves, which have containment fields which are quite sturdy. They can actually withstand an airplane crashing into them. It's the power lines that have been getting shelled, which is what we saw being shelled just yesterday. The nuclear power plant requires constant energy running through it. This is what Rafael Mariano Grossi has been warning about. He said, according to the IAEA, that while the ongoing shelling has not yet triggered a nuclear emergency, it continues to represent a constant threat to nuclear safety. Volodymyr Zelensky has said that two settlements in the south have been reclaimed, one in the east, in the Donbass region. We know that in the Kherson region, there has been in the making for a few weeks now. Ukraine has been hitting railway links, ammunition depots, and bridges with long-range mobile artillery systems. But now they seem to be moving troops into the area. There's images on social media showing Ukrainian troops taking back villages, raising the flag. But we know scant details, again, because of this operational security that prohibits journalists from visiting the front lines. Russia says that Ukraine is suffering significant casualties in their counteroffensive, that they have not been successful. Ukraine has not given many details, but again, Volodymyr Zelensky saying that 2 villages have been reclaimed. Early reporting by CNN saying that 4 villages in that direction have been reclaimed.
That's Sergio Olmos reporting there from Kyiv. Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs analyst and history professor at American University. Klaus Larres is a European affairs analyst and professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Also with us is Dmitry Babich. He's a Russian journalist and political analyst. And Sergiy Kudelia is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Sergiy Kudelia, the nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, has been to that plant. They visited there. Their inspectors were there. And they say there is potential for an accident there because most of these safety protocols have been compromised. Now, President Zelensky of Ukraine, he has accused Russia of using the plant as a weapon, and Russia in turn has said that Ukraine has been shelling areas near that plant. What do you know about this, and how do you think it could be resolved?
Well, the only way it can be resolved is if Russia withdraws from the power plant that it captured several months ago. It keeps all of the staff of the power plant there, working under the guns, under the barrel of the gun. Russian soldiers are accompanying local employees to their workplace, and they are monitoring everything they do. So it is clear that it is Russia that is causing this threat of a possible nuclear disaster. And Ukraine certainly would not be interested in any type of nuclear accident happening there, because if you just look at the map, it's right there on the Dnieper River, a major transportation route for Ukraine, and it would be primarily contaminating a large area of central Ukraine if any major nuclear explosion happens. So this is not in the interest of Ukraine to cause any type of an accident on the power plant.
And so, hey, what about these reports that Russia has been shelling areas near the plant? In fact, the former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, he said to use his words, he said that's 100% nonsense.
Well, the nonsense, of course, is the fact that Russians believe that they can capture a power plant that is on the foreign territory and try to disconnect Ukraine from this power plant. Remember that about 20–25% of all electricity that Ukraine requires comes from this power plant. So Russia is controlling the power plant as a very important lever of influence over the Ukrainian economy. And if they try to disconnect it from the Ukrainian electricity grid, this will represent a very significant damage to the Ukrainian economy. And that, I think, is really nonsensical, that in the 21st century, we're seeing this kind of actions on the part of a foreign power.
Dmitry Babich, as Sergio just told us, this is a power plant that supplies about a fifth of Ukraine's electric energy supplies. Russia is holding on to it. What is the strategic aim here?
It depends on whose strategic aims you are talking about. I would say that if you look at the map, as Mr. Kudelia is suggesting, you would see that if something happens to that plant, Russia would suffer also. You know, when Chernobyl disaster happened in 1986, and Chernobyl was located much further from the Russian territory, there were several regions in Russia which suffered from its consequences for 20 more years. I remember how I went to Tula region in the late 90s, and the governor of the region told me that the consequences of Chernobyl were number 2 or number 3 problem in his province, which is located right near Moscow, actually. So no one is interested. I mean, neither the Russian people nor the Ukrainian people are interested in having something happening there. However, there are several hard facts which I think show that Russia is definitely not to blame here. The Russian troops have been controlling that area since early March. And nothing happened there. There were no bombardments until late August, when the Ukrainian army acquired these new long-distance weapons from the United States and from the EU countries. Second, as Mr. Kudelia says, maybe the Russian troops control some of the workers working at this plant, because there were cases when they were detected correcting the artillery fire of the Ukrainian forces, which obviously damaged the plant. As for Russia's interest, this power plant supplies electricity not only to the part of Ukraine which is still controlled by Zelensky, but also to the parts of Ukraine which are now controlled by Russia.
Right.
As for cutting electricity, Russia is definitely not the first. In 2014, as soon as Donbass refused to recognize the new government in Kyiv, Kyiv cut all electricity and water supplies to Donetsk and to Lugansk, and no one in the West protested. For 3 days after this, the New York Times and the Washington Post wrote that probably Poroshenko was wrong to do it, but then they forgot about it.
Okay.
And
Dmitry,
since then, Russia has been supplying them with electricity.
Right, Dmitry, I want to turn to another development right now, and that is Russia has turned off the gas taps to Western Europe. Initially, we heard that Nord Stream 1 pipeline had some problems and they needed spare parts to fix the issue, but they couldn't get the spare parts because of sanctions. Now the Russians are saying that they've turned off the gas taps because of sanctions that have been imposed on them, and that they will only resume shipments of gas once those sanctions are lifted. What does Russia want here?
I can tell you, of course, it's a tit-for-tat action, because when Russia stopped constructing almost entirely at its own expense the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, suddenly the Germans said that they couldn't get it started because there was some certification work that they couldn't finalize. There was some bureaucratic formalities that could last for another year. And so that pipeline never became operational, even though it was finished, and it can be restarted at any moment. So I think the Russian government is trying to make Germans try their own medicine. Okay, you try to make fool out of us, pretending that you can't start that pipeline because of bureaucracy. Now have a feeling of our bureaucracy. Maybe we cannot operate Nord Stream 1 because of some technical difficulties and because, according to the sanctions, our turbines cannot be repaired on time. So, and also it would be very strange if Germany supplied weapons to the people killing our soldiers and we would continue supplying Germany with gas as if it was business as usual. There is no business as usual in Europe. Everything else is hypocrisy.
Klaus Larres, this is what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had to say about the closure of this pipeline. Let's listen.
In recent days, Russia is trying to put even more energy pressure on Europe. The Nord Stream gas pipeline has been completely stopped. Why are they doing this? Russia wants to destroy the normal life of every European in all countries of our continent. It aims to weaken and intimidate all of Europe. Where Russia cannot achieve this by force of arms, it seeks to do this by force through energy weapons. It's trying to hit Europe with poverty and political chaos, where it cannot yet use rockets.
So, Klaus, what do you make of the issue that Europe now faces? As Dmitry said it, Europe's getting a taste of its own medicine.
Well, it's a very difficult situation, of course, but, you know, of course, in Europe, there is no normal situation. But the reason why is because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We should not forget about that. Who started it all? Russia invaded Ukraine, and that brought on all the crises we are talking about. And for Russian troops to occupy a nuclear power plant is absolutely crazy. It's difficult to say who was shelling who and when and so on. But the Russian troops should not be there at that nuclear power plant. And Ukrainian technicians should run the power plant, not with the help of Russian technicians who don't really know much about that Ukrainian nuclear power plant. The same applies to the gas deliveries. Of course, Putin cut off the gas deliveries through Nord Stream 1 because of the war. He wants to divide Europe. He wants to bring down European standard of living. He probably hopes that there will be uprisings in European cities, and there were some uprisings. There was some protests in Czech cities, also in German cities. And of course, he hopes that that will proliferate, that the European countries will be at each other's throat and will basically, that the united front against Russia, which the Europeans have so far put forward, that that united front will break up. Clearly, he is blackmailing the Europeans with gas and with Nord Stream 1. And if there are two other pipelines actually from Russia to Europe. There's the pipeline going through Ukraine and also the pipeline, the Turk Stream pipeline. And with both pipelines, if there was a fault in Nord Stream 1,
Klaus, if I can just stop you there for a minute, Klaus. If you say President Putin is trying to blackmail Europe, I mean, we had a situation where the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she complained that Russia is weaponizing energy. It seemed a little bit bizarre, isn't it? Because she was an enthusiastic supporter of sanctions against Russia, saying, we don't want your energy.
Yeah, but the point is that Russia started the crisis. Russia invaded Ukraine, and you cannot let that country get away with such aggressive action. So sanctions were imposed. This is very true. But the Russians have always said they would adhere to contracts. And there is lots of contracts to deliver oil and gas to Europe. These contracts were concluded long before the war. And so far, until the war, we could always rely on Russia fulfilling its contracts, never mind what political crisis there was. But now, for the first time, Russia is cutting off gas despite its contract. This runs counter to everything Russia has done so far. But of course, invading Ukraine is also counter to anything Russia has done recently.
Anton Fedyashin, I just want to get back to a point that Klaus mentioned a moment ago, that there have been demonstrations in European cities. We saw that demonstration in the Czech Republic. 70,000 people took to the streets there. There were also demonstrations in Cologne, in Germany, as well as in Paris, in France. Could this weaken the resolve of West European countries in their united front against Russia?
It not only could, it will. And what we saw this past weekend is just a foretaste of what is assured, guaranteed to become an increasingly complicated situation in Europe, because for now the weather is reasonably warm. It's early September. Come mid-October, the northern part of Europe is going to be descending into winter, and so the Europeans will be faced with a very difficult choice. Either stay the course with sanctions on Russia, which are destroying Europe's economies, or start pushing towards a peace, which is clearly not going to be on Ukraine's terms, but this will allow Europe to save its economy. And let me just put this energy issue into perspective. The question of cheap gas, which is what has allowed Europe to develop so successfully economically over the past 40 years, at least 50, you can stretch it back to the early 70s. The question of gas is not just about heating. The question of energy is about economic performance. And so what cheap Soviet and then Russian gas gave to the Europeans was a really important competitive edge on the global markets. Once the prices go up, not only is this going to be difficult for ordinary Europeans, where, you know, some of them will have to face the horrifying decision between feeding themselves and heating themselves, but the economic ramifications of industrial goods prices going up are going to have a long-term effect on European economies in general. Moreover, the more money that European governments will have to spend to subsidize their populations, to prevent them from going out into the streets, and there are politicians speaking openly about this, the less money Europe will have to bankroll the Ukrainian state. So I see no easy solutions except for a path towards peace, but that's going to be almost impossible to accept for Vladimir Zelensky's government.
Sergiy Kudelia, what's your response to what Anton just told us?
Yes, a couple of points. So first of all, I'm not sure why Anton believes that peace on Ukraine's terms is not possible. The war is not going Russia's way. We see that in April, Russia announced a major offensive in Donbass. Well, that offensive is still going on. In fact, Russia is stuck in Donetsk Oblast. It failed to capture, apart from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, any major towns in Donetsk Oblast. And that situation continued for weeks now. It also announced referendum that were scheduled to happen in Kherson, in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, in Kharkiv Oblast, regarding the possible annexation of these territories. And what's happening now? Well, all these referenda plans are canceled because Ukraine is waging a very successful counteroffensive operation that began last week and that basically destroyed a lot of logistical supply routes for the Russian troops, especially in the south. Today, Ukraine launched a second counteroffensive operation in the northern part, in Kharkiv Oblast, directly threatening the two major towns there, Izium and Kupiansk, that are controlled by the Russian troops. And it does not seem like the Russians are actually successful in any of the goals that Vladimir Putin articulated in February. It doesn't seem like Russians will be able to capture any more territory. And the big question is only when Ukrainians will successfully kick Russians out of Kherson and other parts of the south. So the peace will happen, but I do not think it will ever happen on Putin's terms and on Russian terms.
Right.
And the reason why the war continues is because Putin lives in the illusion that somehow he can win this war, which is completely unwinnable for the Russian side.
Right, Dmitry Babich, President Putin has been talking about Russia's goals in this conflict. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
та трагедия, которая сейчас происходит на Донбассе.
The tragedy that is now happening in Donbass is the result of the actions of the nationalist, neo-Nazi regime that took over the power by force and then initiated combat activity in Donbass, twice conducting military operations using heavy artillery, aviation, heavy armor, and so on. And all of this is going on to this day. Our duty is to help those people, and that is what Russia is doing.
So, Dmitry, that's what Russia is doing, but what do you make of Sergiy Kudelia's points that Russia's not winning this right now, it's losing, in fact?
There is a lot of fog of war or what is going on, and I would not jump to conclusions. I think both sides have shown themselves to be very determined to win, and both sides have very high stakes. Unfortunately, the position of the Western governments has changed. You know, in the beginning, they said they would not support any strikes against Russian territory. They would not supply long-range weapons. That they didn't fulfill. You know, there were strikes against Crimea, which the United States supported openly. So I think Klaus is right when he says we should view this whole situation in context. So I'm not going to speak I'm not going to say who is winning. I'm just going to give you some facts because it's very important to see this in the perspective. When Klaus said that Russian technicians have nothing to do at a Ukrainian nuclear power plant, he just doesn't remember, maybe doesn't know that Zaporizhzhia power plant was built in 1984, 7 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was built by Soviet engineers from Ukraine, from Russia, from Kazakhstan, mostly from Russia. So, of course, their advice would be most precious, but the nationalist government of Ukraine since 2014 has been blocking any cooperation with Russia on nuclear safety. It has been using American nuclear fuel for this plant, which is dangerous because the plant was not suited for that fuel. It was suited for the Soviet fuel. The same story about all of that began when Russia invaded Ukraine. No, it all started in 2014 when there was an illegal regime change in Ukraine, helped by the United States and by the European Union, in which the legally elected president was ousted, and the people who elected him in the east of the country started protests, which grew into a civil war that the government in Kyiv continued by military means. This is the real context. And I think that in this case, both Anton and Sergey are right in their own way. I think Russia cannot win 100%, and Putin cannot achieve his aims, which were obviously to make Ukraine absolutely safe for Russia without any NATO bases and probably controlling most of its territory. On the other hand, Ukraine will never get back Crimea with its 2 million of Russian people living there, and Ukraine will not get Donetsk and Luhansk, which it has been bombing for 8 years, killing thousands of people there.
Okay. Klaus Larres, I want to get back to something that Anton Fedyashin told us a moment ago, and that is that there is going to be increasing pressure on European leaders, European governments, the longer this conflict takes place, as we get into the winter months. And that resolve that they have to prevail in this conflict against Russia might begin to falter.
Well, before I answer that, can I just say that despite the events of 2014, which are of course controversial, I have no idea how these events can justify a brutal invasion of Ukraine and the attack on civilian targets, the attacks on hospitals and kindergartens, and the widespread torture and killing of civilians and soldiers in Ukraine. How 2014 can justify that is totally puzzling to me. And I think this is a strange and bizarre argument to make. Regarding the European situation, yes, I agree. It will be very difficult. The winter is coming and there will be energy shortages, but we should not underestimate the firepower, the financial firepower of European governments. Many governments, like the German government, for example, are actually quite rich. They can afford to subsidize their civilian population, to give them additional money so they can afford to pay additional gas or gas at higher prices. And many other governments will do that as well. And the poorer governments in the EU, they, of course, should get subsidies from the EU in Brussels and also from the solidarity of the other EU member states, the richer ones. And I think Jean Monnet once said that Europe was forged in crisis. And I think the current crisis can be an opportunity for the EU by them moving closer together to perhaps a real political union. This is, of course, wishful thinking. We don't know if that will happen. But I'm kind of optimistic that despite all the terrible difficulties right now, in the end, the EU will pull through and no one will starve and no one will really despair because we can't afford to heat his or her home.
Okay, Anton Fedyashin, I'm going to get to one final point, and this is a report in the New York Times on Tuesday that Russia is now, quote, buying millions of artillery shells and rockets from North Korea, unquote. The Times report attributes this story to American intelligence, but provides no independent confirmation or reporting of its own on whether this is in fact true. It simply reports what it got from one of the American spy services. It also reports that Russia is buying drones from Iran. What does this tell us?
Well, it tells us one of two things. Either the Russians are running out of drones and out of shells, but to be honest with you, I've been hearing that for the past 6 months, and they don't seem to be slowing down. Serhiy is right about the fact that the Russians have significantly, territorial progress has slowed down in Donetsk. But that's because they've come up against the most fortified areas in east of Ukraine, and they're actually slowly making their way through them. The other thing that it tells us is that Putin may be seriously entertaining the notion of an offensive in response to the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians have launched. And he certainly has the money to purchase more arms than the Russians already have in order to throw them into the fight, which tells me, as I've been saying for months, that from the grim realist perspective, things look fairly grim as we go from the summer into the fall of 2022.
Okay, and that's where we are going to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks to all of our guests for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.